سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الإخوة والأخوات الحضور، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسرني بالنيابة عن الأستاذ الدكتور حاتم القرنشاوي عميد كلية الدراسات الإسلامية جامعة حمد بن خليفة أن أرحب بحضراتكم بهذا اللقاء العلمي المهم مع أستاذنا الدكتور حبيب أحمد. وأود أن أشكر الحضور أيضا، يعني باعتبارنا في نهاية الأسبوع وداخلين على الويكند، فنشكركم على التضحية والتكرم بالحضور. والحمد لله الحضور يعني كبير، وهو له يعني دلالته القوية على اهتمام الحاضرين بالاستماع إلى هذه المحاضرة القيمة بإذن الله. I would like to just introduce our guest, our speaker. Professor Habib Ahmed is a visiting professor at the moment at the Islamic the Faculty of Islamic Studies, the Department of Islamic Economics. And before he joined our faculty, he has been a professor and the Sharjah Chair in Islamic Law and Finance at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. And before joining Durham University in August 2008, he worked at the National Commercial Bank and the Islamic Development Bank Group at Saudi Arabia. And he taught also at the University of Connecticut, National University of Singapore, and the University of Bahrain. Professor Ahmed also has authored and edited more than 65 publications, including articles in international referee journals, books, and other academic papers and monographs. His current research interests include contemporary applications of Islamic commercial law, product development in Islamic finance, inclusive finance, and the integration of Waqf and the financial sector. I would like to welcome him and enjoy his lecture bismillah, and after the end of his lecture we will open the door for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalifa. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon or evening actually. I also, like Dr. Khalifa, want to thank everyone who has come here. It's late evening and also beginning of a weekend. I really appreciate that you have taken your time to come and listen to me, and I hope it will be time worth spent. We'll know that after the lecture, hopefully. As you see, the topic of my lecture today is knowledge economy and Islamic finance, a new institutional economics perspective. As you know, we talk about knowledge-based economies nowadays, which basically says that economies, in order to develop and grow, they must generate knowledge, use it, and this should be done in every level. Recognizing the knowledge, the importance of knowledge in economies, the World Bank has come up with two indices. One is the knowledge index, and the other is knowledge economy index, because they think that contemporary economies are actually knowledge-based. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the role of knowledge in an economy, provide a theoretical basis of how to include knowledge in the economy, and to do that I'm going to talk about the new institutional economics perspective. Then I'm going to talk about the status of knowledge in the Muslim/Arab world. Actually, it's difficult to get information and data on the Muslim world, so I'm going to mainly look at the status of knowledge in the Arab world. and then go on to talk about implications for Islamic finance, looking at the framework, the new institutional economics framework, and conclude my talk by looking at ways in which we can improve the knowledge economy in general and the Islamic financial sector in particular. So let's move on. I'll probably talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll open up for question and answers. If you look at how knowledge is viewed in economics, we have the traditional neoclassical approach, where knowledge is incorporated into the economy through the growth theories. Now, the neoclassical growth theory would look at capital and basically say that knowledge is embedded in capital. They do not explicitly talk about knowledge. It was in the 1980s that we have the new growth theory, which includes knowledge explicitly into a growth model. But then it talks about it in a very aggregate way. You have three factors: labor, capital, and knowledge. And it talks about knowledge being an important part in growth of economies. Compared to these theories, when we look at new institutional economics theory, it gives a very comprehensive perspective of how knowledge is an integral part of economies and how they grow. Actually, new institutional economics are very critical of the neoclassical economics. They think that the neoclassical economics does not look at the structures of economy and how they evolve. It was, as you see, it is new institutional economics. That means there was an institutional economics. It was Douglas North, among others, who had discussed the new institutional economics during contemporary times, and actually he was given a Nobel Prize for his contributions to new institutional economics in 1993, I think. So what the new institutional economics does is it looks at structures and evolution of economies in a multidisciplinary way. And it looks at societies at 4 different levels. And these levels are the culture, institutions, organizations, and market and transactions. Now, what I'm going to do is talk about each of these 4 components of the new institutional economics, because that's how they, in some ways, explain how an economies evolve and develop. When it comes to culture, I have here 3 definitions. The first definition is a micro definition about individuals taken from Hofstede and Hofstede. They say that culture is patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. In short, it is software of the mind. So we're talking about individuals and what culture means for them. Then we have a definition by Gertz, who says that means by which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop knowledge about attitudes toward life. So here we see that knowledge is mentioned as a part of culture. And the third definition is the most comprehensive definition, and this is taken from Arab Human Development Report 2003, and it defines knowledge as all human contributions to ideas, perceptions, customs, socio-political systems, and economic constructs. And this is the perspective which new institutional economics take about knowledge, that it is actually the basis of, as you see, political systems, customs, and economic constructs. So I think when Arab Human Development Report were defining culture, they took the definition of the new institutional economics perspective. Now, before we go, I just want to briefly mention about culture, and it can be viewed at different levels. We can view culture as the core, which basically relates to the ontology of when you talk about philosophy and ontology, which basically assumptions of human existence. It relates to beliefs about existence, why do we exist, about life and death. At the middle layer, we have culture, which relates to values and norms. When you talk about values, We're talking about a group of people, they believe in what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. And norms are basically the practices of groups. Usually values and norms should go together, but a lot of times we see norms or practices which divert from values. And then of course we have the explicit, the outward experiences, appearances of culture. And this is what most people talk about when we talk about culture. This relates to, for example, language, dress, art, architecture, which people can see about different cultures. Moving on to the second level of analysis, we're talking about institutions. Now, as you see, the new institutional economics, they define institutions in a much broader perspective. Usually, when we talk about institutions, especially in Islamic finance, we're talking about banks. But here, as you see, institutions are not banks. Here, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about the political system, the state, the constitution, the justice system. So what we usually call as institutions in new institutional economics, it will be called organizations, which will be the next level of analysis. So institutions would include public institutions like executive, the judiciary, the legislature, the courts, the bureaucracy. It's the institutions which determine in any society the human and political rights, the rule of law. For economics, it defines property rights and rules of their exchange. So basically, when you talk about institutions, it provides what is called the formal rules under which individuals and organizations in an economy operate. At the third level, we have organizations. Organizations are a group of individuals who come together with a common purpose of achieving certain goals. Of course, we have for-profit organizations, the firms, the banks, businesses, but in the contemporary economies, we also have a lot of other types of organizations. Non-profits, for example, would constitute a very important part of an economy. Then you can think of schools, unions. So any grouping of people, when they come together to achieve certain goals, would form an organization. In organizations, what is studied is the structure of organizations, how they're governed. And when these are discussed in economics, the issues discussed are related to efficiency, the incentive structures, minimization of transaction costs, and risks. Finally, we have the last level of analysis where we look at market and transactions. Basically, as you see, it is the markets where the allocation and exchange of resources, goods and services take place. When we look at markets and transactions, we can look at it in two ways. One is to look at it from an economics perspective, look at supply, demand, and markets, how they act and interact. The second way to look at this level is to look at it from a legal perspective as a nexus of contracts. In markets, whenever exchange takes place, it takes place through implicit and explicit contracts. And in that sense, we can look at the markets as a nexus of contracts. Now, it's the technology, as you see, the prices, costs, and risks, which determine what type of products will be produced and what type of contracts will be used in the markets. Now, as I mentioned, the new institutional economists, they criticize the new classical economists because they say that they actually just look at this level of analysis. They just look at the market, supply, and demand, and they stop it there. But from their perspective, this is only one level of analysis, and there are other factors, other levels which actually affect this, all the transactions in the markets. Now, how does that happen? They talk about two ways in which economies and structures can change. One is the intrinsic evolution, where economic structures evolve. And here, the key assumption is that it is the culture which basically entails the knowledge. So from culture, where we have the knowledge, this knowledge base determines what type of institutions an economy will have. Again, if you remember, we're talking about institutions in terms of the laws, the regulations, the judiciary. And then the institutions, they determine what type of organizations economy will have. So if there is a law, for example, for corporations, you can create corporations. If, for example, there's a law for waqf, for example, you can create a waqf. If there is no law for waqf, legally you cannot create a waqf. And actually there are some Muslim countries where there are no waqf laws, that means legally you cannot create a waqf. So it's the institutions in terms of the legal and regulatory framework which determines what type of organizations can exist in an economy. And of course, one of the functions of the organizations is to produce goods and services which are exchanged in the market. Now, the key factor here in terms of how economies evolve is the role of the knowledge. As you see here, it says the stock and production of knowledge determines the institutions and organizations. What type of institutions a country will have will depend on what type of knowledge is produced in the culture. So as we talked about culture, it should represent the values and norms of the society. And the institution should reflect these values of, and if the culture produces that knowledge, then we'll have institutions which reflect those values. So the speed and direction of change in economies will depend on the rate and the kind of knowledge produced. So this is in some ways the basic framework of the new institutional economics of how economies evolve. And as you see, that knowledge plays a very important role in this evolution. Of course, there are other ways in which change can take place, but these changes are usually minor. And this starts from either the transactions of the organization level. So in this kind of structure, the institutions remain the same. Of course, the culture affects the transaction. And then you have, for example, there is a demand for certain product. And the organizations, they react by producing that product. So here, the changes here in the transactions, which basically we're talking about products and the organizations, these are marginal changes. It does not change the institutions, the legal system, the regulatory system. Sometimes when you have a certain sector which grows significantly, the governments can come and change the laws. So the changes in the institutional structure are marginal. They just change a law or add a few clauses in the laws or regulations to accommodate certain products and organizations. In conclusion, this part, we see that in a new institutional perspective, knowledge is embedded in cultures, institutions, organizations, and products. So when we talk about knowledge economy, we're not just talking about products. We're talking about knowledge embedded in the legal system, the regulatory system. We're talking about organizations are embedded with knowledge. And the conclusion about intrinsic evolution in economies is that if you have a culture of learning and innovation, this new knowledge is reflected in institutions and organizations. And this kind of economy will be producing knowledge-based products and services, and of course consuming them. But if we have an economy where cultures are slow to produce and use knowledge, then we basically have stagnant institutions and organizations. And these economies will be mainly factor commodity-based economies and passive consumers of knowledge products. And actually, to see whether economies are dynamic and producing knowledge, you can look at some of the legal or the laws of the country and in some ways predict whether the economies are evolving in terms of changing the institutions, the laws. If you look at some laws of some countries, you'll see that these laws were made in the 1950s, sometimes last century, and they have not been changed. So that means that the society is not producing the new knowledge to change the legal system, the regulatory system for contemporary times. Before I go and talk about the status of knowledge, because knowledge is a very important part of new institutional economics, I just want to briefly mention a few concepts about knowledge. To create knowledge, it has to go through a process. And in literature, we see that there are different ways in which this is mentioned. I have put here three things: data, information, and knowledge. And sometimes they have 5 classifications. Before data, they talk about what is called noise. Noise, in a sense, there's a lot of things out there. I mean, noise in a statistical sense. From that noise, you create the data. Data is basically raw descriptions and observations about past, present, and future worlds. From the data, when you put human effort, you can extract information to identify patterns in data. But that is not knowledge, because you cannot, information, if you cannot use it productively, usefully, it is not knowledge. So knowledge, you need more effort to create knowledge from information, and this results from human reflection and efforts. So after this, the next stage is, there are as some literature also talk about wisdom. To use the knowledge in the right way would be the wisdom. Then we have this distinction about knowledge wealth and knowledge capital. I think United Nations Development Program, they have classified this for societies and economies. Knowledge wealth is basically the sum total of knowledge assets, and this would include not only the knowledge content, but also institutions, for example, schools, universities, anything related to knowledge provision and creation. And then they talk about knowledge capital, which basically is part of knowledge wealth used to produce new knowledge. So you may have a knowledge wealth, but if none of it is used to produce new wealth, the knowledge capital will be basically absent. Given this structure, basic structure, let's move on to see what is the status of knowledge in the Muslim and Arab world. What I've done here is, before I look at some contemporary tables, I have here 2 slides, one talking about the knowledge in the Muslim world in the past, and one slide looking at the knowledge, 2 quotes actually, in the present. As we know, I mean, this is well known, Islamic knowledge creation reached its zenith in the 10th century and remained at a high level until the 17th century. And I have here a quote from Franz Rosenthal, who used to teach at Yale University. I think he passed away now. This is from his book called Knowledge Triumphant, which talks about knowledge, the status of knowledge in medieval Islam. And as you see, he says that in this book, there's no other concept that has been operative as a determinant of Muslim civilization in all its aspects to the extent as ilm. And then he says that ilm is Islam. And this is his reflection of what this civilization was. And ilm, as you know, is the knowledge. Now let's fast forward to the present. And here we have a quote from Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Suleiman, who, as you know, was rector of Islamic University in Malaysia and also with the IIIT in Washington. And in one of his works, he describes the current status of knowledge. And he says the Muslim mind has lost its ability to give birth to new ideas, to update its institutions, and to produce the planning, means, and policies essential to further progress at the civilizational level. If you remember, one of the definitions we had about culture was the software of the mind. So if you think of this mind, we can actually replace it with culture also. So it's talking about the current Muslim culture, which has lost its ability to give birth to new ideas, to update its institutions, and to produce planning, means, and policies to further progress in civilizational level. I think a strong statement. But let's look at the status of knowledge, the knowledge wealth in Muslim countries. Now, I have used Arab states because this is what I get from these sources. They don't give any information on Muslim world. I mean, that you have to go and calculate yourself. But I think it in some ways reflects the Muslim world. So these are some summaries of the adult literacy rate, and it's pretty recent. It's 2011, taken from database 2013. And this shows the total literacy rate average and the female literacy rate. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you see the Arab world, and I mean, it's not only lower than the world average, it's also lower than the developing countries average. I mean, you have 79.8 and it's 76.9. And the female literacy rate, as we see in most cases, is lower than the total. So you have here 74.2, and in the Arab world, it is 68.4. I have a few slides, just to go over them quickly. Now this, again, from the same document, or that's the reference of the document, it shows a projection in the future in terms of the number of illiterate population in different regions. Now, this is 2011, and this is a projection for 2015. Now, the greens show that the numbers, absolute numbers, will go down. Now, you have to remember, of course, that the population is going to increase, but over the next 4 years, the green means that the absolute number of illiterate population will go down. But the red means that the numbers will actually increase. And we have in the regions actually only two. One is sub-Saharan Africa, where the numbers of illiterate will increase both as total and female. And the other region is the Arab states. I mean, it will increase marginally. I mean, it's from 60 to, but even then, I mean, if you're talking about growth and knowledge economy, this should definitely go down. Now, what we talked about was the quantity, and then there are some measures about the quality of knowledge and education. And when we talk about quality, we usually, and most people use this TIMS. This is a Boston University-based system. I think it's called Trends in International Math and Science Studies or something like that. And what this group does is, over the years, they look at math and science skills for 4th graders and 8th graders. I've just picked up the math skills for 8th graders. And as you see, this is the average. The total is from 700. Singapore scores the highest. It's, no, actually, Korea at 613. And this is the average of some of the countries in the region. Again, on the average, we see that they are lower. Now, of course, these are the most, what should I say, the highest ranked countries. But on the average, we see that countries in the region score less when it comes to the quality of education. Then let's look at the knowledge capital, which means the resources used to produce new knowledge. And again, this is actually depressing. You see the global R&D expenditure share percentage. When it comes to, in this case, they separate between Arab states in Africa and Arab states in Asia. As you see, they are, even if you look at the global research and I mean, I think this is not an interesting, this is probably an interesting information. You have research and development expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So for the world, the average is 1.8. So the 1.8% of the world GDP is used in research and development. If you look at Africa, it is 0.4% of the GDP. And we see that these, the Arab states are actually investing even less than the African states. Interestingly, if you look at Israel, it is actually the highest is the country which is spending the highest in research and development in terms of percentage of GDP. This 4.3 is the highest in the whole sample. Then this shows how many researchers are there per million of inhabitants. And again, if you look at the world average is 1,000, and then we look at the Arab states, it is pretty small. Then another index of knowledge creation, and this relates to the patents. And this I've taken from Arab Human Development Report. Actually, there's an updated information on it. I didn't have time to, but this I think is in some ways reflective of the reality. So we have here in this report, they list these countries and the total amount of patents which originated over, you see it's almost 20 years. And then some other countries, and if you again look at what Israel had in terms of patents, is much higher than what all these countries together produce in terms of patents. And I got information on OIC. As you know, OIC is a group of, I think, 57 or 58 Muslim countries. Their contribution to patents is only 1.5% of the world total in 2009. And if you know, I think the population of the Muslim world is close to 20%. So we have 20% of the Muslim population producing only 1.5% of the total patents in the world. And finally, we talk about the knowledge index and knowledge economy index. I think the knowledge index talks about what are the resources used or what are the resources used in a country to produce knowledge. And when we talk about knowledge economy index, it talks about how these resources are used for development. Again, we look at the world average is it's over 5%. For the MENA, it is less than 5%, which is lower than the world average. When you look at specific countries, some of the countries are better than others. I think UAE scores the highest in the region, and Qatar is also okay. I mean, it's 54th ranked. So that was, in some ways, a depressing picture, but that's the status of knowledge in the Muslim world. Now let's move on to Islamic finance. Now, when you talk about Islamic finance, I think we have to talk it in some perspective. It has a history. Islamic finance is a part of Islamic economics. And I mean, it's supposed to be a sector in an Islamic economy. And as you know, that Islamic economics was actually officially, there have been discussion on Islamic economies for some time, but it was officially launched in 1976. And the objective of launching Islamic economics was to come up with a just and humane alternative to the ideologies of capitalism and socialism. In the 1970s, capitalism and socialism were the two, in some ways, ideologies competing with each other. And during that time, Islamic scholars, they came up and said that we have probably a better system. This system would fulfill the maqasid al-Sharia, and it will actually provide a balance between the conflicts which we see in socialism and capitalism. Basically, the conflicts can be summarized into growth and equity. In the capitalist system, you can produce growth, but equity becomes a problem. In a socialist system, you have equity, but growth becomes a problem. And what the Islamic economists said that in an Islamic economy, we'll have a balance between growth and equity. So we have to remember that we're talking about growth and also equity. And equity is a very important aspect of an Islamic economy. Now, of course, we don't see any application of any Islamic economics other than in the financial sector. So we have what we call the Islamic banking or financial sector sub-economies existing within economies. We all know that it has grown rapidly, is growing rapidly. 15, 25% But of course, with its growth, there are questions about whether it's reached its objectives, whether the quality of its output products are up to what the expectations when we see what Islamic economics talked about, fulfilling the maqasid, a balance between equity and growth, among other things. This table is taken from a survey which was done in 2012 in Malaysia, basically asking people about what should be the objectives of Islamic finance. And here you see that there are 5 answers. This would carry a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this average here basically shows what is the average of these answers for each. So as you see, prohibition of riba and provide Sharia compliant products rank very high, almost they're similar. But the stakeholders, the people who use Islamic banking, they also list these other social elements to be very important for Islamic banking and finance. So you have promote sustainable development. They ranked it lower than the legal issues, but as you see, they are ranked higher than the last one, which is maximizing profits. So maximizing profits relate to the growth aspect, and these relate to the equity aspects. And this is what the stakeholders of the industry actually expect when we talk about Islamic finance. But this is my understanding. I'm trying to use the new institutional economics perspective in terms of what has happened to the quality of the industry in terms of not providing a balance between growth and equity, and the taking care of the social, and even actually some legal stipulations. What was needed from a new institutional perspective, new institutional economics perspective, was to create the knowledge which could have supported the organizations, the institutions, and also the products. And I think that did not happen. We had some ideas of what Islamic finance, we had this what we call the data and information on Islamic financial principles, but we did not put the effort to create the knowledge which could have supported the industry. So if you look at the ways in which innovation can take place in the industry, actually this has appeared in some writings that there are 2 ways. One is reverse engineering, where basically Islamic banks and Islamic financial sector are producing Islamic replications of conventional products. So you look at a conventional product and you just make it Islamic. And the other is the innovative engineering, which is to come up with Sharia-based products. And this would be different than this approach. This would need effort, because what you're talking about here is you go to the consumers and see what they need and then come up with products which fulfill their needs. Here what you do is, the approach is you go to a conventional bank and see what product they have and then try to replicate that. Unfortunately, the bulk of the innovations have been similar to the reverse engineering. And in a survey on product development of 20 banks, we found that only 8 banks out of the 20 had a structured idea generation process, which basically means that there is no attempt to invest in research and development. If you cannot invest in idea generation to come up with new products, the only option you have is to go and replicate conventional banking products. Now, what has happened as a result is that the Islamic banking models have evolved. We have the ideal banking model, which the economists talked about, the 2-tier Mudaraba model, which basically said that on both the asset and liability side, there will be profit loss sharing modes being used. But of course, this model was just a theoretical, ideal concept. When Islamic banks started to operate, they found that it is very difficult to use equity-based contracts on the asset side. So they moved on to what we call the second-best model, 1-tier Mudaraba model with multiple investment tools. So on the liability side, they had Mudaraba, profit-sharing investment accounts. On the asset side, you have multiple investment tools dominated by fixed income contracts. And then, of course, it didn't stop there. We have moved on to the third best model. I don't know if you can call it best, but this is the third model, which is basically a fixed return on both liability and asset side. You have fixed income investment accounts, usually structured by using Tawarruk, and then you have assets which are multiple investment tools but dominated by Tawarruk. Now this basically replicates a conventional banking structure, which is in a conventional bank, there's no link between the return which is given to the depositors and the returns which the bank makes. They're separate. So this is basically you're separating the returns on the deposits from the returns on the asset side. Now, given this changes, actually, we see that there have been a lot of discussions, at least in academic circles, about what is happening. I have here quoted a few lines from critics and also some quotes from supporters. Critics, we see Salim was an investment banker, actually from US, who came to Middle East to work in an Islamic bank, and he got frustrated, went back and wrote 2 short books. One book was called Islamic Finance at $300 billion, The Deception. He then wrote another book calling Islamic Finance a Charade. Then you have some academic writings which came up in journals. Hamoudi, he's a professor, law professor in, again, America, calling what Islamic banks are doing as jurisprudential schizophrenia. And along with the same line, Holden talks about Islamic finance practice as legal hypocrisy. And finally, we have Mahmoud Al-Gamal, a professor at Rice University, talking about Islamic banking as rent-seeking Sharia arbiters using ruses or hila to circumvent prohibitions. And as I said, it's also some of the proponents. For example, Islamic Academy in 2009 declared this should be organized. Organized Tawarruk is not Sharia compliant. And scholars like Nijatullah Siddiqui, he tried to make an economic argument against Tawarruk, saying that harms outweigh the benefits, and as such it should not be permitted. Yusuf Di Lorenzo, he's a Sharia scholar who also sits in the IOFI Sharia board. He looked at a product in the market, total return swap, which is basically a replication of a conventional swap, not acceptable from a Sharia point of view. And we all know about the famous Taqi Usmani paper, which he said that partnership sukuk issues were not Sharia compliant. Now, that was the academic thing, and then I'm just going to present you a couple of survey results, which shows the perspectives of the clients, the Muslims, on what's happening in the industry. And this is a UK-based survey. And the question here basically says Muslims have doubts about banking products in Islamic financial institutions. Muslims believe that Islamic banking is just change of names. 1 means strongly agree, 2 means agree, and these are means they don't agree. So for us, these 2 are important. And as you see, these numbers are pretty high. I mean, they add up to almost 74%. This is the perception of the Muslims in UK. And when I actually showed this to students in my class, one student said that maybe these people who are interviewed, they are not educated. And so I went back and looked at the thing, and actually most of them were educated. Some were doctors, some were academics, some were engineers. I mean, the bulk of them were educated. And I have a feeling that more educated you have, the more skeptical you are about what's happening in the industry. And then, so I mean, these are in some ways alarming. And maybe this is one of the reasons that, Islamic Bank of Britain in UK has been operating for the last, 7, 8, 9 years, and it has been making losses. Because they had overestimated the client base. They thought that a lot of Muslims will come and do Islamic banking, but it didn't happen. This probably explains partly why, because a lot of them feel that there's no difference between Islamic banking and conventional banking. Now this is again another survey on business officials in Pakistan. So again, these are people who are in business, and they were asked a question about Islamic banking versus conventional banking. 44% said they're different, almost 23% said they're similar, and 33% said they don't know. Now this don't know itself is important in some ways. That means we have a Muslim population who don't know what is Islamic banking. And that's where again the knowledge comes in. The culture, the knowledge. We're talking about Islamic banking, but people who will use the Islamic banking, they don't know what it is. And you see it's a significant number, almost 1/3. Then you have quite a large number who think, and this is in Pakistan, I mean this is a Muslim country, where a significant number of the people think there's no difference between Islamic and conventional banking. So I think these are in some ways serious issues when it comes to the practice of Islamic bank. It seems there's a reputation and credibility issue. Now, how do we move forward? If we look at the new institutional economics perspective, I think what has happened in the Islamic financial industry is that it has taken a marginal adaptation approach. And we know the history of Islamic banking. It was actually the first Islamic, if you talk about the financial institution, the first financial institution was in Egypt, Midgamar, and it was a small cooperative-based structure. It did not last. The first Islamic bank was in Dubai. A businessman wanted to open an Islamic bank, and he had very sincere, objectives. But there was no change in the laws. There was no change in the. We didn't have a model of what organizational structure to use, so they borrowed a conventional banking structure. So you want to do Islamic banking with an organizational structure which does debt-based financing. And you cannot do Mudaraba, two-tier Mudaraba model with an organizational structure which does debt-based financing. So in some ways that reflects that we did not produce the knowledge to support the organizations or the institutions in terms of the laws to support this industry. Now, if we use this framework, the way forward is that we can have a healthy growth of the industry if we take a holistic approach in terms of changing the institutions which support the industry, and also changing the organizations. When you talk about organizations, we're talking about, you don't have to, if you want to do, for example, social banking, you cannot use a conventional banking model. You have to come up with different models which, organizations which can fulfill that. And we do have some historical models which we can use, which we have not used in the Islamic financial sector. So let's look at a case example which in some ways has been successful to some extent, and try to understand why they have been successful. And of course, the example is Malaysia. Now, Malaysia, as you know, under Mahathir, they came up with a Vision 2020, and this was the document which came up, Mahathir's idea in 1991. So they said that in 30 years we want to be a developed country. And in a document which is available on the internet, they identified 9 challenges they have to resolve to become a developed country. And actually it's a very interesting document, because when they're talking about development, they're talking about morality, they're talking about ethics. And I sometimes feel that if there is, quote unquote, an Islamic economic model, probably it's Malaysia. If you look at that document, it reflects a lot of these ethical, moral, social issues, which is not just looking at the growth. They're talking about growth and balance, basically balanced growth. So one of the challenges they identify in this vision document is the establishing a scientific and progressive society, a society that is innovative and forward-looking, one that is not only a consumer of technology but also contributor to the scientific and technological civilization of the future. So this is a challenge they thought they have to overcome to fulfill this vision. And actually they took proactive steps to do that. One of the things they did was that they wanted to be an exporter of education. And actually they have been successful. Exporter of education in terms of, now we see a lot of people going to Malaysia to get education. So you have people paying fees to Malaysian universities and getting education. So they have been successful. When it comes to the financial sector, there were two documents which in some ways reflect their structured approach to develop it. The first one was in 2002, they came up with a 10-year financial sector master plan. And in this master plan, they have specific targets for the Islamic financial sector and what to do to support the Islamic financial sector. The second one, as you see, they have a financial sector blueprint now, which is another 10 years. And one of the objectives of this blueprint is to advance Malaysia's thought leadership in Islamic finance. So there has been deliberate efforts to include knowledge as basis for development and growth in the economy and also in the Islamic financial sector. So the result is that I think we have in Malaysia a lot of knowledge created related to Islamic finance and also a lot of research and development taking place. I just picked this up from a recent report which says that in Malaysia you have 50 course providers and 18 universities offering Islamic financial degree. So in total you have basically 68. And I think you also know that ISRA and INSEF. ISRA these are two institutions which are created by the Central Bank of Malaysia. For INSEF, they actually created a 500 million ringgit trust or foundation to support this, and then they also have ISRA. And the whole objective of these two institutions, this is a research academy, and this is basically a postgraduate university. The objective of these two is just to focus on Islamic finance and develop the knowledge to support the industry. And we see an example of what is the result of these policies. I think last September, we had this 9th International Conference in Islamic Economics and Finance held in Istanbul. And this is the largest gathering of Islamic economics and finance, and Qatar QFIS was an important partner in this. And if you look at the number of papers submitted and accepted from Malaysia, 108 of 300, I'm talking about the English papers, or 35% came from Malaysia. And out of the papers which were actually presented, 24 out of 84, which is almost 29%, or almost a third, were coming from Malaysia. Now you have to remember that Malaysian population is only 29 million, which is 1.8% of the Muslim population. Now, actually 29 million, I think 55-60% are Muslims, so it's probably even less. So you have 1% of the Muslim population producing this kind of research in a major conference. It's just an indication that they are actually investing in knowledge creation and knowledge base for Islamic finance. And the other thing is the institutional development. Malaysia probably is one of the countries which has the most developed legal and regulatory framework for Islamic finance. And as you see, they have different laws, which the latest law was, and this itself is a reflection, if you remember what I said in terms of culture, knowledge, producing, changing laws to suit the new reality. As you see that they have changed laws. They had the Islamic Banking Act. This one also relates to Islamic finance, and then they have another latest law which has, in some ways, a very good framework for development of the Islamic financial sector. And one of the things in this law is that about the quality of Sharia compliance. Actually, in this law, if a bank fails to be Sharia compliant, they've made it a criminal law. And person responsible can go to jail for almost 8 years. Then you have another structure, the robust Sharia governance regime. They have a central Sharia board which looks at different products going to the market. They have a governance framework for Sharia governance at the bank level. Then you have a lot of supporting regulatory guidelines which support the industry. So this is the institutional framework under which Islamic banking is operating. Concluding remarks. Well, we see from the new institutional economics is a strong interplay of knowledge and economic development. And due to lack of knowledge creation, Islamic finance, or for that matter, the Muslim world has been a marginal adapter because we are not producing the knowledge to create our institutions which reflect our values. The question is, if you look at the new institutional economics perspective, the first level of analysis is culture. The question is there something wrong in the culture which is inhibiting us to produce this knowledge? So I end with this question, but before I open up for questions, I have 2 facts and some questions for you to ponder upon. The 2 facts are taken from a book by Dan Diner, who has written a book called Lost in the Sacred, or something like that. And then he's basically saying what happened to the Muslims, why did they stand still? And in the book he talks about different things, and these 2 things are from his book. And this is a very interesting observation. You know, the first printing press was invented in Germany in 1469. And this has a very important role. When you talk about a printing press and where you can mass produce things, if you think of a world before that, if you wanted to read something, it was written by someone. So in terms of knowledge conveying to masses, it's extremely difficult if you don't have printing press. But what happened is that during that time, there was a ruling given by the Ottoman Mufti that it is haram to use printing press. And the reasoning he gave was that if Quran is printed on that, there will be mistakes and things like that. But it was a general ruling. And eventually, there were no printing presses in the Ottoman Empire, which was the Muslim empire, for 300 years. Now, Dan Diner says that probably one of the reasons the Europeans had this industrial revolution and the scientific progress they had was because of this printing press. Because what this printing press did was it made knowledge available to the masses. And for 300 years, this was not available to the Muslims. So this fact, I think, is a reflection of the culture I'm talking about in terms of towards education. The second thing he mentions, which is more recent, in the 5 years in 1980s, he looked at the number of books translated into different languages. And for in the Arab world, he cites that there are 4.4 books per million inhabitants translated into Arabic. The corresponding numbers for a country like just Hungary was 519 books translated into Hungarian, and in Spain it was 920. Now given this, and again this I think is a reflection of culture. Given this, these are some questions for you to think about. There are many questions, I just picked these. Are the interpretations of the text producing distorted values related to knowledge creation? Is there tension between values and norms? Values, I mean, if you think of values when it comes to education, I think Islam has values which are very promotive of knowledge. I mean, it's a religion where the first revelation was Iqra. But when you talk about norms, the practices, we see it's very different. Do norms reward education and knowledge creation? And finally, and I think this is also very important, especially in a new institutional perspective when we're talking about culture, what is the status and education and role of women in society. And actually women, they play a very important role in transmitting culture. And if you have women who are educated, you're talking about they are producing generations who will be educated. And if you have women who are not educated, the future generations will be basically will reflect that. Okay, with that, I conclude and open up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Habib, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to open up the floor for some comments and questions. And I'd just like to remind the international audience who are watching online, you can email us your comments and questions, and we'll try to squeeze them in if there's time. Any comments and questions? Kareem? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very refreshing lecture. I wanted to actually go back to the slide that had the four different elements of new institutional economics.
This one.
Yeah. So I had questions and observations on this. So the first one is probably with regards to the relationship between culture and institutions itself. When we think of Islamic economics as it started in the 1960s, 70s, one of the arguments is that we should have done more homework before we actually started our institutions. I would think that that is probably the new, the NIE probably perspective on things.
Yeah.
But on the contrary, when do you say is enough? When do you say is enough knowledge in order for you to start your institutions? Because I think that there was also a lot of benefit of starting the institutions and then feeding back into the knowledge in a sense that we're learning through practice and then we're actually improving through that. Because sometimes, where is the threshold that you're going to say that this is enough knowledge, now we have to go and start implementing? And I mean, it's just a difficult thing to gauge. So that's question, comment. A second one that is, with regards to the Arab world,
Yeah.
I would argue that we are producing knowledge. It's just that sometimes our knowledge is not taken by institutions seriously enough to actually reform. So we have another issue that has to be taken into consideration is, do our institutions actually reform, or is the knowledge just kept on the shelf and the institutions are lacking a process to reform, even though the knowledge is being produced by the academics in the Arab world and so forth? Yes, it's not comparable to the academics in the Western world, but it's just that link between the institutions of society and the knowledge production is a lot weaker than in the, and I think that's enough. Thank you.
Actually, in terms of a threshold knowledge, I don't think there is any. It's because you'll, by the way, Douglas North, he was an historian, economic historian. So he looked at the evolution of different types of economies. And these are the general kind of explanations he found in his study of how economies evolve. So there is no threshold level, but it's a question of probably a degree rather than an exact amount, right? Now, when you talk about, for example, now I showed you some figures about different countries, different regions. It is a relative thing. The key thing is that to renew your institutions, you need to feed in the knowledge. Now, when you talk about the institutional structure, that itself may be structured in a way that does not allow you to feed in the knowledge. And I'll give you a very interesting example, actually, and that is from Waqf, for example. You know, Waqf was one of the institutions in the Muslim civilization which supported so many social activities. In the past, the governments didn't provide education, health, even the roads and lighting. These were all provided by the Waqf. And now, if you look at Waqf, it is a dead institution. And it is dead partly because of the. Now, if you look at the Waqf laws in most countries, in some countries, Waqf law doesn't even exist. So legally, you cannot create a Waqf. In countries where Waqf law exists, if you compare the Waqf law with the other structures, you can use non-profit organizations. The Waqf law are outdated. It's more actually costly to create a Waqf than if you create, for example, a foundation, for example. If you create a Waqf, the government has the right to come in and interfere anytime it wants. If you create a foundation, you are free to do whatever with. So these legal structures basically has destroyed this institution. I'm not saying this is the only thing, but it is one of the important, I think, aspects which is inhibiting its growth. Now, if you think of the knowledge on Waqf produced by the scholars, contemporary scholars, they made it very flexible. In 2009, Pacific Academy came with a resolution where they made Waqf extremely flexible. But this has not translated, so the knowledge has not been translated into the institution level. And if it doesn't happen, so when you're talking about the institutions, we're talking about the structure itself, which is restrictive. Now, as for the second question, it was related to knowledge and institutions.
Yeah, I think you just addressed it with regards to that comment that you just made.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Crane?
Yeah, I have two related questions. One concerns definitions and the other some logic. You said that you had three successive levels of knowledge, data, pattern analysis, and product. And you said if the pattern analysis has no product, it's not knowledge. And I would think it would be better to think of three levels of knowledge. They're all knowledge. But the most basic are, as you say, the values, norms, culture. You get a product from that. Second question is not on definitions, but on assumptions. You said that there's a trade-off, and there should be a balance between growth and equity. That certainly would be true if you're assuming a wealth gap. But if the institutions can broaden ownership of productive capital, you would not have that. You wouldn't have to balance it, because the broader the ownership, the more productive the economy would be. So this is a matter of assumptions. You seem to be assuming that economics will always continue the existing wealth gap.
I really didn't get the last question or comment.
Oh, well, if Islamic banking, for example, instead of mimicking Western banking or just trying to eliminate riba, would focus on broadening access to wealth. So, well, I mean, theoretically, every person could be a little capitalist. Yeah. This would be a third way beyond socialism and capitalism. Then there would be no conflict between growth and equity.
Yep. And actually, that's what exactly Islamic economists, when they talk about the balance, they talk about these issues that you have a system which inherently will have these features which will balance the social and, the equity and the growth aspects. And one of the things they mentioned was that, for example, the financial sector will not only cater to the needs of the very rich or the middle class or upper middle class, but also it will cater to the needs of the poor, for example, provide them with the access so that they can also basically use financial resources like microfinance, for example. We know that microfinance is one of the tools used to alleviate poverty, but most of the microfinance, Grameen Bank and others, they're all conventional. So we have, in terms of microfinance and the social financing, not too much in action in Islamic finance. As for the first question, you're right. Actually, I mean, again, these are the descriptions, but the difference between data, information, and knowledge is that knowledge has to be useful. But sometimes data and information, they don't, actually, most of the time, they're not useful because you cannot really use them. You use data information to create knowledge, and this knowledge has to be useful. Otherwise, I mean, it's information. Yeah.
Dr. Hassan?
I have two remarks. I would like to start first with the equity issues, which you try to contrast the socialist and the capitalist system. I will look at it from different perspectives. If I look at the capitalist system, which is, I think it is a concentration of wealth. It means maldistribution of wealth, which create different levels of really unequitable type of distribution vis-a-vis if you look at the social system, which actually it is distributed the wealth of the nation equitably. If you look at the efficiency issue and growth, you can really look at the Western system, the capitalist and free enterprise system. Where you look at the unemployment issues, it's non-existing in the socialist system. So I just wonder how you compare and contrast this from an Islamic perspective, from economic point of view. I wish also if you can return back to your paradigm of knowledge, culture, institutions, organizations, and the transactions, which you can call it the market. I love to hear if you could be just elaborating a little bit further by explaining all these areas where the culture of a nation, as you define it, which is explicitly well taken care of, that definition of the knowledge based on the culture. But if you look at the areas going to create the institutions that compatible to that type of culture, given the geographical location, giving the values of that society, and if I put it between quote and quote, I call it an Islamic society or an Islamic country. Okay? What are the impediments and what are the process that can expedite the process of the knowledge based on the culture to create that institutions to help? So the arrow has constraints and incentive to change and develop and to evolve to create the type of a dynamic type of institutions. And then the reaction of this institution, I rather look at the same arrow A2, which can create the type, the organization that can fit to expedite those Islamic nations to develop those type of organizations, really, as compared to the Western organizations, and then to explain at A2 what are the constraints. Why we wake up in 1972, we're talking about Islamic economics and Islamic finance and economic banking. Why not before? Of course, there are exogenous and endogenous type of variables and constraints exist. And I wish if can be elaborated in your this paradigm you presented to us. Thank you.
Well, you have quite a few questions there. As for the first question, in terms of the socialist and capitalist and where Islamic economics would fit in, Islamic economics will be probably resemble more a capitalist economy because it believes in private ownership, it believes in markets, but there would be some sort of oversight to not only follow the laws, but we expect an Islamic economy to be also ethical and also social, responsible. Now, this is what the Islamic economists are doing to define what an Islamic economic system should look like. I mean, it started in the 70s. There was a lot of discussion on it in the 70s, 80s. Then Islamic banking and finance came in. Everybody started doing Islamic banking and finance and forgot to do research on Islamic economics. Very few people are actually discussing what should be the nature of Islamic economics. As a discipline, I think it's still very underdeveloped because I think a lot of basic concepts are not clear now. There's still debates on very fundamental issues which define an economy. So I think even as a discipline, it has not developed to that extent. We have the broad guidelines. Now, when we talk about the initial writings, they talked about, as I said, it would be a market economy, but with oversight, with some systems. For example, one of the things is talking about zakah and awqaf institutions, which will in some ways look at the equity aspects also. In the financial sector, banks would be, of course, there, but I think a lot of non-bank financial institutions would be there to perform provide other services to different segments of the population. Again, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of research to really conceptualize this model. But as I mentioned, I think Malaysia probably is a good model, which in some ways reflects what an Islamic economic system would look like. And that brings me to your second question in terms of a country, in terms of how institutions affect organizations and how culture would produce the knowledge to change institutions. I think probably I went over it very quickly. Malaysia, if you see, they have changed all the laws. I mean, the latest is 2013. 2009, they have a central bank law where they have actually a very important issue related to Islamic finance, where they've given the National Sharia Board the authority to oversee cases in courts. So all of these changes in the legal laws and is providing basically a legal support to the industry. Now you have a lot of countries, a lot of Muslim countries, where there are no Islamic banking laws and there are Islamic banks operating. So that means that they have not, if there is any disputes in this, in the transactions they do, they go to a court. There's no law supporting the industry. And it is actually, in a lot of countries, you have that problem. And if you have a country where there's no Islamic banking law supporting the sector, a lot of times to comply with the laws, you actually compromise on a lot of Sharia-related issues. So in those countries, Islamic banks, maybe they mimic conventional banks because they don't have any alternative, but because when they follow the laws of the country, they have to change the products which fulfill the laws of the country, which do not support Islamic banking. I don't know if I've answered all of your questions. You had a lot of queries. Maybe we can discuss this further.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. إذا تكلمنا عن أن الثقافة موجودة إلى أن نصل إلى النمو المعرفي، فأنا أقول أن هناك أولا أننا نحدث التنمية من خلال الوعي، التنمية الاقتصادية من خلال أن ننمي الوعي الداخلي الموجود لدى المجتمع، بالتالي تغيير الثقافة بما يشمل مفاهيم كل الثقافات والتغيير الهيكلي في المناخ الموجود حتى يتيح لنا أن نغرس الثقافة الإسلامية بمعاملتها داخل النفوس. بالإضافة إلى أن الاقتصاد المعرفي أو اقتصاديات المعرفة نريد أن ننتقل بها إلى عصر المعرفة. في الوطن العربي لم ننتقل إلى عصر المعرفة ولا حتى مجتمع المعرفة. كما نعلم أن في التاريخ الاقتصادي هناك التطور الزراعي أو اقتصاديات الزراعة، ثم الاقتصاديات الصناعة، ثم اقتصاديات عصر المعرفة منذ الخمسينيات من القرن الماضي. ولكن أين نحن الآن كوطن عربي ومجتمع إسلامي؟ هذا أول سؤال. أما السؤال الثاني فهو وليس سؤالا ولكنه ملاحظة عامة، فإننا نحدث المعرفة من خلال الإطار الحديث للتنمية. تكلم عنه العلماء مؤخرا أن هناك إذا افترضنا أن التنمية الاقتصادية تقوم على موارد اقتصادية في نطاق جغرافي معين، فنحتاج إلى الشراكة المجتمعية. هذه الشراكة المجتمعية في وجود الموارد الاقتصادية، الرابط بينهما المعرفة أو القيام بالمعرفة أو التعامل بالمعرفة ونشر ثقافة المعرفة والبحوث القائمة على الموارد الاقتصادية حتى نحدث التنمية. والتنمية هي أشمل من النمو، كما حضرتك تكلمت فقط لنا عن النمو المعرفي، النمو الاقتصادي، أن المعرفة هي عنصر هام من عناصر النمو الاقتصادي. أما أنا رأيت أن في أغلب المقالات أن المعرفة عنصر من عناصر التنمية الشاملة والمتجددة، بل كما يقولون الآن بالمستدامة. بالإضافة أن مسألة التمويل الإسلامي ظهر في الستينات حقيقة وليس في السبعينات. رأيت في أحد الكتب كتاب بنوك بلا فوائد للدكتور أحمد عبد العزيز النجار، يتكلم فيه عن التجربة التي حدثت في الستينات في مصر في متغمر ببنك بلا فوائد. فأنا أريد أن أعرف صراحة كيف حدثت الفجوة، بأنه هناك في السبعينيات وهناك بنكا رائدا حدث في الستينيات وتم إهمال هذه التجربة حتى الآن. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Thank you for your question. As for the first question, or maybe I'll talk about the second question, where especially talk about the interest-free banking. Actually, I did mention about Midgummer experience. I don't know if it got lost in the translation, but I did mention it, and I usually say that Islamic finance started in 1960s and Islamic banking started in 1970s. So, yeah, you're right. And actually, if you look at the Midgummer experience, it was a social banking. It was not commercial banking. And it was about financing the farmers and in a rural setup. So I think in some ways that reflects more the spirit and values of Islam than the banking industry which evolved. Now, as for the first question, actually, I personally feel that even though we're talking about knowledge economy nowadays, my personal understanding is that this has been the case all over, during the history of mankind. Any civilization which dominated in production and use of knowledge dominated the world. And when we talk about the so-called golden age of the Islamic world, if you see, it was the Islamic world which was producing the knowledge, and that's why they dominated the world. So even though we are revisiting knowledge and things like that, this is, I think, has been the fact, and that all over time. Even if you talk about agriculture, production and these things, they also involve knowledge. There are different types of knowledge, but you cannot have agricultural growth without the right knowledge which relates to the crops. And now you have modern agriculture in terms of irrigation, the fertilizer. So all of these are, and a lot of investment is made to increase the productivity of. What I'm saying is that knowledge had played a role throughout the history, and within the economy, it plays a role in all sectors. It's not just, when we talk about knowledge, we're not talking technology, we're talking about everything. As for the other, relating to the awareness, I think awareness is not enough. Because what happens is, you may be aware, so you have what I call data, you have information, but it is not useful unless it is converted into knowledge and made useful for humans and the environment. And so for that, what is needed is the problem is the culture is very slow to change. there is a need for these institutions. Basically, you're talking about institutions, the government, we're talking about the polity, who are in the government. They have to make these conscious decisions to impact the knowledge culture within societies. And again, probably Malaysia is I've given it an example which reflects that. As you saw, they had this Vision 2020, and a very important part of that is about knowledge. And that is reflected not only in the economy, but also in the Islamic financial sector, which is probably the most robust. Now, let me just say one thing. Currently, we know that in Malaysia, there are some financial products which are controversial, which may not be accepted, for example, in GCC. But given this new institutional framework, I see the future of Islamic finance much, much better in Malaysia than in the Gulf, because in the Gulf, all we see is action here and maybe here, nothing happening at this level. And so what we have in the Gulf in Islamic finance is market-driven. And if it's market-driven, we know that you're talking about just profits, just growth. You don't have the other aspects. I hope I have touched on the questions you have raised.
Okay, I'm gonna take one question from the internet. We have a listener, I believe he's in Saudi Arabia. He hasn't mentioned, Dr. Nisati Aiden. And he's asking a couple of questions. I'm gonna read out one of the questions. He says that you mentioned Malaysia to support the argument that we need to develop institutions for economic and financial success. I agree with you that Malaysian success comes from visionary leadership. However, my observation is that it is government-led institutions rather than market or socially driven one. To me, such a development model is not stable. Once they lose visionary leadership, they are confused how to act. On the other hand, institutions in the West are largely market-driven. I wonder what you think about this difference. How can we come up with stable structural institutions in the Muslim world? So that's an interesting question.
Yes, it is an interesting question. Actually, if you look at the structure, the question is how do we change, for example, a society which is not producing the knowledge is stagnant. Now, the culture is, if you look at the new institutional economics literature, they say that culture is extremely slow to change. And this is one of the features of culture. And actually, they say sometimes it takes centuries. If you leave it to the culture to change itself, it will take centuries to change. But if you have, then what else we have? In this structure, we have institutions. And institutions, of course, now in the nation-state institutions is about government and what governments do with different things, including organizations, products. Now, I understand his question that if it is imposed from the top, maybe it will not be stable. If the leadership goes, it will probably go with it. And sometimes it's said that in Malaysia, the development of Islamic finance is top-down. Example of a bottom-up example is, for example, Indonesia, where a lot of these financial institutions are not supported by the government, but it's coming from basically the people. So that is definitely definitely you have a different model, but I think in contemporary nation states, these institutions, basically the government definitely has a very important role to play. Now, in terms of one of the changes which I think in the Malaysian model we see is the creation of knowledge, which is actually seeping in different institution levels. Now, I personally know that, as I said, that if you look at the current practice of Islamic banking and finance in Malaysia, you have a lot of controversial products. But I personally know that you have now a lot of young people who have got educated and who have seen this data and information about perceptions of people, what is the expectations of people and what they expect from Islamic banking and finance. Because of this education, they have started to influence the sector. And we have, and this influence is at different levels. We have scholars who have done the PhDs in Islamic finance, gone back to central banks. We have scholars who have gone back and teaching at universities, and then they are changing the minds of the people. These scholars sit on Sharia boards, and they are changing the way banks operate. So because we're talking about history, this change will take time. But if I think they can change the culture of producing knowledge, after some time this culture will take hold and move basically the other institutions. I don't know if I've answered the question, but this is my understanding.
Okay, I'm going to take the advantage of having the microphone. I'm going to add a few comments of my own and maybe a few more puzzles. There's a paper by Rahman and Hussein Askari called the Economic Islamicity Index.
Yeah.
And in the paper, I'm sure you've read it, they've tried to create some sort of an index to measure how Islamic an economy is.
Yeah. And very few Muslim countries are there.
Yeah, and very few Muslim countries are high on the list, and it's actually the non-Muslim countries that are more Islamic on that preliminary sort of index they created, which is an interesting puzzle. Why is it that the non-Muslim countries are more Islamic than Islamic countries? And I think that's an interesting research project if anyone's interested to undertake that. Similarly, if you talk about business ethics and Islamic business ethics, the record of Muslim countries is appalling, even though normative Islam is quite clear on business ethics issues and things like that. So I think you mentioned a few times, at least in the paper that you wrote, that we need to somehow create new Islamic knowledge, but I think the Islamic knowledge is existing. The normative Islam is very clear on issues like child labor and things like that, yet our record in these issues is appalling, which is an interesting puzzle. Why is it that the non-Muslim countries are performing well in these areas? And if you look at preliminary evidence, maybe there's a hint of it in the data that's collected by institutions like CESRIC. They have data such as the secondary education enrollment rates in Muslim countries is about 50%. Whereas in the developed world, it's about closer to 90%. So there's some preliminary evidence for why that could be the case. You talked about the legal environment as an institution. I mean, they also have data on that the cost of enforcement of contracts is also double that of the non-Muslim world. So that's an interesting puzzle if anyone wants to take it upon themselves.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
To build the institution, we need the human capital, yeah? And to build the human capital, we need the culture, we need knowledge, we need ethics, we need faith. So Islam began with Iqra. And we all, Muslim, we know about that, but we don't practice. So what's the solution for good practicing so we can build the institution, we change the culture? What's the key words for that solution, or what's the solution for that puzzle we have? That's one question. The other question,
you're talking about a question I raised myself, right?
yeah.
This is a question about the values and norms, practice.
Yeah, because I lived in Sweden and they have a lot of ethics, and the ethics affect their way of working, the effects or their way of doing things. We have the ethics in Quran, but it's not affecting us. Why it's not affecting us? And the fatwa you give to us about printing press, it's strange. That's one fatwa affecting a whole empire. So yeah. So what's
Words
the solution? Yeah, yeah. It's coming because the fatwa is coming from top, so it was affecting the people, or because there is no one can say that's not haram or not halal. What's the problem was? So we avoid that in our future.
I think in some ways it reflects the culture. I mean, this fatwa, which of course came from the chief mufti of the Ottoman Empire.
So
that's why it was, and his logic was that because printing press will be used to print Quran, and printing press, because of this initial stages, when you printed things, it was, there was a lot of errors in it. But that, again, he actually talks about similar issues in Judaism, but he says that distinguished between the sacred text and the non-sacred text. So in Judaism, they said that, okay, you cannot use the printing press for sacred text, but for non-sacred text, you should be allowed. And I think that should be the approach. Unfortunately, it was banned, and it was banned for 300 years. And I think that was enough to make generations. I mean, just think of it. If you have to read books which are only handwritten in terms of mass education, and that probably explains a lot in terms of the gap in the Muslim world, and the 300 years was lost in the process. Now, as for
the solution for how we can develop institution and development human capital, in your review?
Well, I mean, if you look at the new institutional perspective, I mean, there are two things. One is everything starts at the culture. Now, as you mentioned, we have a culture now where our values and our practices are different. As you said, I mean, it's a religion where the first revelation was Iqra, but if you look at the data, we are probably one of the worst in terms of the level of education. So definitely a practice. Now, this culture, which has taken centuries to evolve, is a problem, definitely, when it comes to knowledge and education. And it cannot change by itself, because the inertia of culture is not like that. It has to come from the institutional level, meaning the government. In contemporary nation states, they have a role.
So you believe from top to...
and again, you cannot impose things like that. It's talking about incentives, it's talking about... I mean, one of the things, if you look at, I mean, I sometimes, there's an Italian philosopher who, in a long time back, I read this. He said that to make money, you need efficiency. And to spend money, you need culture. In other words, on what things you spend money shows your culture. Now, we had a culture, in Baghdad, before the Mongols came, it was a much smaller city, and it was a city of libraries, right?
Yeah.
I think there's some reports which said that there were 63 libraries where anybody could walk in and read books. Again, because books were all handwritten and things like that. Yeah. Now you have a Muslim society. Just think of how many libraries we have in our cities. Yeah. And this is what? This is a reflection of culture, because how we are spending. Now, how we change this, it's not easy. Unfortunately, the answer is not easy. And it will take generations. And one of the key things is about the role of women. Actually, I think, there's a Sheikh Akram Nadwi at Oxford Institute of Islamic Studies. He has done an excellent job in terms of the role of women in Islam. Actually, he started a project where he wanted to see the contributions of women in collecting ahadith. And when he went there, he found so much material that he has written 40 volumes. And one of his conclusions from this study is that if you think of the role of women in Islam, her key role is propagation of knowledge. First in the household and then outside. And that's what women used to do in the past. And he has documentations on that. And actually, very interestingly, Ibn Taymiyyah, in one of his, I think, books, he thanks the teachers he has learned from. Names. And in one of those books, he mentions 5 women. Can you think of a sheikh today going to a woman and learning something? And as I said, I think this is one of the key cultural problems we have. Yeah. That we have to redefine the role of women in the cultural perspective. As I said, they are the transmitters of culture. Yeah. If you have an educated woman, you have an educated generation. You don't have, and we saw the numbers. Yeah. This is, I think, one of the key factors. But the problem is immense, and unfortunately, the conclusions are not optimistic, given the reality.
Exactly.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming in and lecturing on such important subjects. It was very vital and beneficial. I have a quick question. I won't take long. It is going back to a quote that I see on your PowerPoint presentation. It has stated the Muslim mind has lost its ability to generate new ideas in many aspects, and that's occurred after the 17th century. And at the same time, I noticed on one of your surveys that you also have in your PowerPoint presentation the amount spent and invested toward research and development by Arab and Muslim nations is very minimal compared to other nations. And I guess I have a question. Do you think that not putting lots of emphasis toward research and development could be the reason that why we as Arab and Muslim minds have lost our ability to generate those ideas? Because I strongly believe that we are, as Muslim and Arab, are capable of generating brilliant ideas that could be used and utilized in all aspects. I just need to get your idea on this.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we definitely, I think, if you look at a lot of problems in the world today, if you look at problems in the financial sector, for example, we say that Islamic finance has the principles which would prevent these kind of incidences. And if it is practiced in the right way, it does. I mean, there have been papers written on that. Now, of course, we are not doing the research to come up with the solutions reflecting those values. What we are doing is, actually this is some professor I met, American from America. He said that after the crisis, we were looking for solutions in terms of what are the alternatives. And he said that one of the things which attracted me was Islamic finance. But then when I looked at what Islamic finance is, I saw that they are getting closer and closer to the very system we're trying to fix. So this is the problem, that we need to develop this culture of knowledge. Now, in terms of spending on research and development, of course, that is a problem. But I think the problem starts much earlier. When we talk about research and development, we're talking about universities and higher education. I think it starts right from the beginning. We're talking about the schools, because that's where the minds of students are created in terms of their attitude towards knowledge, whether they are looking for knowledge, seeking knowledge, they are interested in knowledge. If over those 10, 12 years, they go to school and they're not interested in knowledge, it's too late then, right? So unfortunately, a lot of pessimistic conclusions, but that's, I think, the reality, unfortunately. It's a serious problem and needs serious thinking, especially, there has to be a political which tries to look into these things. I didn't answer your question, by the way.
Okay, go ahead.
No. You're right. I mean, if you look at the Islamicity index, of course, there are some issues about that index itself, but in principle, I agree that most Muslim countries score low in the Islamicity index. Because actually, I sometimes wonder that when we try to make a big issue about Islamic economics, how different would it be from a Western, for example, social welfare state? In a social welfare state, for example, in the Europe, you have all the basic needs of citizens being met. Everybody has guaranteed education, health. It is basically, in some ways, nobody goes hungry and things like that. So in that sense, they probably reflect a lot of what an Islamic economy would look like anyway. Now, the question is, if that's the case, take the value part out. I mean, if you just think of the economics, they represent or reflect what an Islamic economy should definitely look like. And the other point is, even in terms of social environment and those things, I don't think we have revisited these issues because these are contemporary issues. Again, I don't think there has been enough discussion from Islamic point of view related to these, but these are very important issues. In classical fiqh, these were not discussed actually. And this is where we need to produce new knowledge related to these contemporary problems and issues.
First, Sorry, just we'll take one quick question from Indonesia because it's past midnight there, so credit to the guy for listening to the lecture. He's from the University of Indonesia, Faculty of Economics. He's a lecturer. His name is Ilham Reza. Okay, so the question is a little bit off topic, so it's up to you if you want to discuss it. He's saying that Indonesian Islamic banks have gold murabaha product, and is that Sharia compliant? We have a couple of Sharia auditors here who can probably answer that as well.
I think the answer is if it's approved by their Sharia board. And you know, in Indonesia, you have to get your product approved by the Central Sharia Board. So if they have approved it, probably it is Sharia compliant.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a question here, yeah.
First, welcome in Qatar. I have two questions. First one, it is enough to talk about Islamic finance, or we should talk about Islamic business? For example, where is this Islamic marketing, Islamic human resource management, so on? My question, because when I'm going to Ribawi Bank, really I find this team there is more friendly and smile and so on. And when I'm going to Islamic bank, it's not like that. By the way, I already visited many countries and I face this problem. So that's the first one. Second one, again, for this point, from where we can start. Because as I see in many places, even me, by the way, when I'm going to Islamic bank, okay, I go take a loan, and they say that, okay, when you are going to pay this one, it is like that with this interest, let us be frankly. So what's the difference between this one and the Ribawi bank?
As for the second question, I think I've mentioned your views represent some of the views here, right? I mean, this is a problem, right? Muslims believe that Islamic banking is just change of names. So you belong to one of these. You either strongly agree or agree. So that's what I'm trying to in some ways point out, that the practice has become that a lot of people, which is stakeholder, you're a stakeholder as a Muslim, you want to go do Islamic banking. But when you go there, you're confused. And it's a genuine question. As for, I cannot give you an answer. Again, as I said, a Sharia board is there, they've approved the products. I cannot make judgment, but this is a genuine concern and about the industry, because we are stakeholders of the industry. The other thing about Islamic business, you're right. I mean, this is again a reflection of I had a PhD student, and he was very enthusiastic about social responsibility and trying to make an argument that social responsibility is within Islamic teachings, and in the West it is. They have imported it from it's not a part of the business model and things like that. These are emotional talks, but in reality, it's the opposite, right? I just told him, he was from Kuwait, I said that you go to a bakala in Kuwait, and you go to a small store here, which you think is more Sharia compliant? Other than selling of alcohol, in terms of service, in terms of cleanliness, in terms of not selling expired goods and things like that. So, the thing is, we have not, again, talking about renewing the knowledge for contemporary times, the business models, everything has changed. Environment, we're talking about, this child labor. We have to, in some ways, have the discussion which we have not. So, in terms of the knowledge that needs to be created for contemporary times, it's huge actually. But in terms of the effort put, I think it's still, we have probably Islamic economics and finance is one of the most developed areas, and even there you see there's so many problems. So, okay.
Okay, well, it's 9:15. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Sebastian,
let Sebastian ask a question.
One last quick question or comment.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for this very nice lecture. Just like two comments. The first one related to Wujdan puzzle question. there is a very famous quote from Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah saying that Allah gives victory or success to just nations, will they be non-Muslims? Over unjust nations, will they be Muslims? So meaning that, I mean, it's not a question of being or not being Muslim. If you have a just system in place, you're going to reach success.
That's right.
Just another comment with regard to the point you made about scholars trying to, I mean, recognizing the fact that they did or did not study with women. At the present time, you may find scholars like this, especially in Mauritania. Most of the biggest scholars from Mauritania, they all studied with their aunts, or I mean, from women from their own tribes or family, and they recognize it openly, just for the precision. I have a comment related to your presentation that was really good, but at the same time, you did not address the point of how far the independence of those who are producing knowledge is important for this knowledge to be useful. And because I think that's one of the main issues we face nowadays in the development of the Islamic finance industry. And so this is the first part of my question. The second part, if you could elaborate on what's happening in Pakistan, because my understanding, that may be wrong, is that over there scholars are very strong, much more than they may be in other Arab countries. So how far this independence as a practical case is changing something on the ground? Thanks.
You're talking about independence of the scholars.
Yeah, to be able to express their opinions freely without being related to any kind of pressure or economic interest.
I mean, I probably will answer that in a more general sense rather than specifically talking about, because it's part of the culture, right? And I think one of the key factors when you talk about knowledge and its creation is freedom. Definitely that is a part of it. Freedom where you have discussion and debates of issues and then come to a conclusion. Especially when you talk about ijtihad, I mean, it is about, it's a knowledge created by humans, and there is no right and wrong in that sense, but it's a question of having the right to discuss issues, and freedom is definitely a very important part. Now, one of the problems we have is that probably now in terms of Pakistan, you're talking about the freedom they have and the very strict views they're taking. I didn't get that part.
The fact is that in Pakistan, my understanding is that if you take like Sheikh Taqwa Usmani, I mean, the scientific career started before Islamic banking. I mean, he was maybe still the president of Dar al-Ulum and so on. His father was also, he was the Mufti, maybe the president of the Supreme Court and so on. So he had not any need of Islamic finance to build his own CV. So this gives him, I guess, some kind of an independence for him to say whatever he wished to say. And that maybe that may explain that he has been the only one scholar talking so much openly about like issues within Islamic finance. But at the same time, I don't know much about Islamic finance. I just wanted to know if you could give some kind of an insight about it.
No, I mean, the thing is, I'm also not too familiar with, what should I say, the issue you mentioned. But, I mean, it is a problem. I mean, I know that actually it has come in one or two writings of Sharia scholars who sit in Sharia boards. And they said that the way a board is structured is that whatever you have the main Sharia scholar, the head or the chairman, whatever he says, everybody more or less says yes, and there's not too much discussion and debate. I think Dr. Al-Ghari has a paper, he discusses this in that paper. So these are issues, definitely. And again, it's a part of the culture that if some senior scholars is saying something, you usually don't argue and present a different perspective. This is unfortunately part of culture. I mean, and I exactly know what you're trying to get at, that some younger scholars, they may have different views, but they do not express that in that setting, right? But hopefully with this new generation of scholars, we'll have better discussion and results, hopefully, right? I don't know if, yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to close with that. Then Dr. Khalifa, if you want to make some final comments to close the session.
Well, I actually have no comments, but I would like to thank Professor Habib Ahmed for this very interesting and enriching talk. And I would like also to thank all the participants for their questions. And we will meet you again, inshallah, in our following activity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.